Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar titled Strengthening North Carolina's Power Grid and Communities. Thank you for joining us today. My name is David Farmer. I'm a senior engineer and a technical consultant with Advanced Energy, and I'll serve as your host and moderator for today's discussion. Today's webinar is part of Advanced Energy's Exploring North Carolina Smart Grid webinar series. This is the second of 3 webinars we'll be hosting this year as part of this program, and the 16th since the program began in 2017. Advanced Energy is a nonprofit energy firm founded in 1980 by the North Carolina Utilities Commission that provides research, testing, training, consulting, and program design. Our members are Duke Energy, North Carolina's electric cooperatives, and Dominion Energy. Since 2017, our team of technical and training staff have collaborated on this Smart Grid webinar series to provide stakeholders with a convenient option to learn how Smart Grid is changing North Carolina's future. Before we dive into today's presentations, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. First, at any point, if you'd like to interact with us, please submit your questions or comments by clicking in the chat box in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. We'll respond to as many of your questions as we can at the end of the program during our Q&A session. The webinar is also being recorded and will be available on the ncsmartgrid.org website. We'll send out a follow-up email with a link to this webinar recording, and you can also review any of our past webinars on the site. Finally, following the webinar, there will be a participant satisfaction survey. We welcome your feedback, so please take just a few minutes to complete the survey to help us improve our webinars in the future. The purpose of today's webinar is to provide an overview of recent events that highlight the need for resiliency from both a power supply perspective and in the community, to understand the difference between reliability and resiliency, along with additional metrics and goals under consideration for resiliency, and finally, learn about behind the meter and non-wires alternatives being deployed and investigated to create resilient neighborhoods and microgrids to serve customer needs. Today, we're pleased to have 2 invited guest speakers who are highly knowledgeable in the area of electric grid and community resilience. First, I'll provide a brief overview of resiliency, the key drivers, and recent events in North Carolina and across the U.S. that bring to light the need for formalized resiliency planning. We'll also review the activities around developing consistent resiliency metrics that can lead to more consistent processes in resiliency planning. Next, we'll hear from Robert Cox, the Associate Director of UNC Charlotte's Energy Production and Infrastructure Center, or EPIC. Dr. Cox focuses on advancing EPIC's research in the areas of grid resiliency and energy utilization. His team is part of the National Science Foundation's Industry University Cooperative Research Center for Sustainably Integrated Buildings and Sites. This work focuses on the use of data to provide improve energy utilization in buildings. His team works closely with many industries partners, including Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Ingersoll Rand, Duke Energy, and Atrium Health. He's a graduate of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Next, we'll hear from Lee Ragsdale of North Carolina's Electric Cooperatives. Mr. Ragsdale is the Senior Vice President, Energy Delivery and the Power Supply Division for North Carolina's Electric Cooperatives headquartered in Raleigh. Lee is a leader in discovering and delivering innovative energy solutions that simultaneously make our grid more flexible and efficient. Most recently, he has spearheaded North Carolina's Electric Cooperatives distribution operator initiatives, integrating edge-of-grid resources, including microgrid and distributed energy resources, providing enhanced visibility and coordinated efforts across all 26 of North Carolina's electric cooperatives for reliability on the grid. Lee holds a Bachelor of Electrical Engineering from Georgia Institute of Technology and an MBA in Economics from Georgia State University. We are grateful to be joined by our panelists today. So what is resiliency? The idea of resiliency planning is nothing new, but events over the past decade have led to an increased focus. Here we see a satellite image from 2012 of Superstorm Sandy about 10 hours after landfall. Sandy was significant not only in terms of the storm's size and intensity, but the population impacted. Sandy made landfall on the New Jersey shore between the major population centers of Philadelphia and New York City, with impacts felt from North Carolina to Quebec. Loss of life and property was significant. Nearly 10 million people lost power initially. Subway tunnels in New York were flooded, and critical services were stretched beyond their limits. Disruption to the power system and communities stretched for weeks, and similar to the impact of Katrina in New Orleans in 2005, evidence of the storm's impact remains. Not only are storms such as hurricanes occurring more frequently and with greater intensity, but we're also experiencing periods of extreme temperatures, putting stress on the grid, and more frequent attempts at cyber attacks. It's important to note the subtle differences between reliability and resiliency. For reliability reporting and planning, the industry uses established and accepted metrics defined in IEEE 1366. SAIDI, SAIFI, and CAIDI are the most common and measure the duration and frequency of interruptions to the system, both at the system and the customer level. Major events are generally excluded from reliability metrics. We can think of reliability as a measure of system performance during normal or blue sky conditions. Resiliency, on the other hand, is the ability to not only recover from major events, but also to maintain some level of community services during a prolonged event. Resiliency is a capability of a system to cope with adversity arising from both intentional and unintentional threats. While reliability metrics are established and widely accepted, resiliency metrics are still evolving, and we'll talk more about metrics later. We can think of resiliency planning as black sky operations, where major events are the focus. This table summarizes that information. Reliability and resiliency are highly related, but it's important to understand the subtle differences from a planning perspective. Reliability metrics focus on high frequency, low impact events, blue sky conditions, and are defined and widely accepted. Major events are excluded, and the focus is the impact to the power system and customers. Resiliency focuses on high impact, low frequency events or black sky conditions. Industry standards are evolving, and the focus is on the major events and their impact not only to the power system and customers, but also society and communities. Focus of resiliency planning is on high impact, low frequency events, or what we hope are rare occurrences that have a significant impact not only on the power grid, but on the communities served. In the Carolinas, we tend to focus on weather-related events, and the industry is currently dealing with the increasing threat of cyber and physical attacks to the system. But there are also other events like earthquakes and tsunamis, geomagnetic disturbances, more likely in some areas than others, and disruptions to fuel supply that could impact resiliency. How can society continue to function and provide basic human services during these rare but high impact events? In a few moments, you'll hear from our invited speakers about how North Carolina is preparing for these types of events. Significant loss of life and property followed each of these more notable events listed here, but there have been others. And for instance, just this past week, from flooding in the western mountains from the remnants of Tropical Storm Fred. We'll hear about how utilities are hardening facilities in flood-prone areas, how North Carolina is planning for the transportation disruptions, such as the flooding of I-40 following Hurricane Florence. Just this year, the United States has experienced several major events that have stretched both utilities and the communities they serve. The February grid failure in Texas caused by extreme cold, ongoing wildfires in the West, and successive extreme heat waves in the Pacific Northwest have stretched the grid beyond its normal design limit. Drought conditions in the West have also constrained the capacity of hydroelectric generation, in some areas highly dependent on that as a generation resource. And finally, the ransomware attack on the Colonial Pipeline was a wake-up call to the threat our nation's critical infrastructure faces. As mentioned, there are currently no resiliency standards adopted by the industry. This slide is from the Department of Energy's Grid Modernization Initiative. Professor Cox will touch on this more later, but as you see, the process of developing metrics is a complex process. There are direct customer impacts from major events that can be measured, like we do with the reliability metrics, but more importantly, there are also the indirect impacts to community services. The table shows some of the proposed metrics and the data that would be needed to compute the metrics. Developing resiliency metrics will be a drawn-out process involving input from many different stakeholders. Follow this initiative for more information about where the energy industry is headed with resiliency metrics. And now it's my privilege to turn the presentation over to our invited guest speakers. First, we'll hear from Rob Cox of EPIC. Dr. Cox.
All right, thank you, David. All right, I guess with that introduction, I think it's a good setup, I think, for what I'll discuss here and some of the events and context that David provided, and talk a little bit about resiliency and reliability more generally, kind of touching a little bit more detail on what David was discussing, but also talking a little bit specifically about what we have learned through our work here in North Carolina. So, in the state of North Carolina, David touched on this, the fact that there's been a number of recent storms that have impacted us. The key thing to bear in mind is that the number of disasters, and in particular the billion-dollar events, has been increasing over time. So here you see on the bottom chart, essentially the number of billion-dollar disasters that have happened since 1980, and sort of adjusted for inflation. And you can see that the number of events has increased significantly over time, with the total cost of them being the highest in 2018 when Hurricane Florence came through and really kind of drove things in particular that year. But with the number of events increasing, there's a real need to understand how we begin to develop a more resilient grid in North Carolina and elsewhere. So with that context, thinking a little bit, going a little bit more deeper into this difference between reliability and resiliency. So there's really kind of, so I'll touch on the difference between those two things. Reliability and resiliency are all about probability. How likely is a particular event to happen? Okay, and there's two sort of bodies that I might think about that kind of handle issues around reliability. And I bear in mind that sort of the basic compact, I guess, if you will, for utilities is this idea of safe, affordable, and reliable electric power. And so reliability is kind of inherent in the overall sort of utility compact. NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, is sort of the federally approved organization responsible for developing reliability standards for the bulk power grid. And effectively, they use two concepts when they think about reliability. Basically, resource adequacy, ensuring that there's enough resources to be able to supply the load, and operating reliability of the generation and transmission grid, the bulk grid, we call it. Metrics for generation and transmission are used by FERC and NERC. FERC is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and NERC is sort of a broader entity that includes, also Canada. Reliability at the distribution level, so we're down at poles and wires feeding your house, is really handled by state regulatory agencies. And we'll talk about some of those differences as we go through here. But the key thing is that reliability and resiliency can be best thought of in the context of probability. And so I have a graph up here in the upper right, where really what it says is the likelihood of a loss of load, on the order of, let's say, tens to hundreds of megawatts, that's going to happen all the time. The likelihood of that happening in a given year is basically 100%. But the likelihood of having events where you lose, tens or hundreds of gigawatts, well, that's not as likely to happen. And it's hard to plan for things that are not likely to happen because they may not happen, right? So it's the real challenge is how do you deal with things that you can't necessarily project? I know that I'm going to have operating blue sky issues, so I can deal with those, but how do I deal with these other questions? So David touched on the fact that IEEE standard 1366 defines 12 reliability metrics, and utilities typically have to provide values about how they're doing on those reliability metrics to those state regulatory agencies on a regular basis. I see someone said they lost sound. I don't know. Can folks hear me okay?
I can hear you, Rob.
Okay, great.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. So those metrics that they talk about, folks need to be able to report those to their utility or to their regulatory bodies. And there's, several of them. David mentioned one. SAIDI is one that I'll refer to a couple of times here, which is the System Average Interruption Duration Index. It's basically the average outage duration that a customer has in a given year for a utility. So the graph here on the left came out of Duke's Grid Improvement Plan. So you can see here that by 2018, an average customer is looking at about 180 minutes of outage for Duke Energy Carolinas. So about 3 hours annual of outage time is sort of the average across the customer base. One important thing, and David alluded to this in his introduction, is that there's a distinction between what we call major event days and non-major event days. And so this is reporting by Duke down in South Carolina, but it highlights the issues. If I look at sort of SAIDI values over here without MEDs, for instance, if I look at Duke Energy Progress, I see 143 minutes. If we talk about MEDs, I see almost 1,500 minutes. All right. MEDs are sort of, it's almost like the act of God in your insurance policy, right? It's things that are sort of beyond the operational sort of normalcy that we would expect to see within the grid. So it's important to think about those because when we talk about resiliency, we tend to be talking about these MEDs, these major event days. So how do we define those? And the way we define those is really, this is a context in terms of probability. And so it's important to understand these. David called them high impact, low frequency events. We can talk about them all kinds of different ways. In this context, I've defined what I call high probability, low consequence. So in other words, an event, where maybe a tree falls and knocks out a part of a neighborhood. Those sorts of events are very likely to happen in a given year, but they don't impact a lot of customers. Low probability, high consequence events don't happen all that often. So the way that the utilities define essentially what is a major event day is they will take their outage data. So what you see here is a histogram that shows outage data that's been recorded in this particular case for one example circuit in North Carolina. And we did this for one circuit. The utility looks across their entire system. But what I see here is they look at the SAIDI values on a daily basis. And it's a little bit confusing. It's plotted on a logarithmic chart because there's a very wide span of time that you're looking at here. So just to give some context, right here at the marker where it says 5, that basically is an outage time of about 150 minutes. At 7.5, we're talking about 30 hours. And by the time we get to 10 here, we're talking about 2 weeks. All right, so this is from a circuit near Wilmington. So we're going to come back to this and kind of talk about this, but when we talk about major event days, we talk about this information over here, where there's several events that last, several hours or more, which are highly impactful. They can have pretty high consequences, obviously, but this data gets thrown out. So when those SAIDI values get reported to the utility, there's a methodology for figuring out a threshold. You throw some of that information away and effectively don't use it. And so your SAIDI values are reported on these high probability, low consequence events. And that's really important because we need to think about what to do about these sort of high impact events. So to talk about that a little bit more, if we want to think about those major event days, we really have to get to defining resilience. And David talked about this and introduced some similar definitions. But I like to think of it in terms of this graphic that is shown here in the upper right, which is really about how we deal with three things: preparing for events, withstanding events, and then recovering from those events. The definition that I like to use is one that was defined under the Obama administration here, which talks about the resilience being the ability to prepare for and adapt to changing conditions, and most importantly, withstand and recover rapidly from those disruptions. So the way we think about this is the system performance is what's shown on the y-axis here. So we know that during the event, the performance drops, and then there is this period of recovery. All right, so we think in this context, and I'll talk about that context a lot as I go through my presentation today. All right, now because these events have low probability, it's really difficult for utilities to prepare because they don't know how often these sorts of events are going to happen. And as we'll see, we don't necessarily know what events we're necessarily fully focused on because every event's a little bit different. The important thing is, NARUC, the National Association of Regulated Utility Commissioners, points out the fact that resilience definitions are way too imprecise to be used as a regulatory term of art. That's difficult. In other words, it's very difficult to be able to sell to a utility commission that you're making improvements to the grid to improve resilience, because this is really a new concept that we've been focused on. NARUC, points out two big issues. First of all, that most of the metrics that we have right now undervalue the impact of these large-scale events. In other words, like I said previously, they just throw away those major event days. And the other issue is they price lost load at a flat rate. In other words, we know that if you lose power for a week or 2 weeks, there's a really compounding effect of losing that load. It's very difficult to be able to quantify that, and most metrics really don't talk about that sort of value of lost load and how it expands over time. So the way that I like to think about this, this is a chart of the number of customers without power in a particular part of North Carolina during Hurricane Florence. And so you see outages began here around September 13th of 2018 when the storm first began to make landfall. And you see this chart actually goes out for several weeks. Effectively, what you're looking at here is the number of customers without power goes way up immediately, and then stays high for a while, and then sort of slowly goes back down as different parts of the system are restored. The way to think about resilience is really in two ways. The first piece for me is increase robustness. In other words, take the number of customers that are outaged and drop that down. In other words, have fewer customers who are outaged. And the other piece of it is improved response time. So basically, those customers that are outaged are not outaged for as long. So basically trying to compact that curve. All right, that's the way that we tend to think about resilience is how do we get fewer people outaged and get those who are outaged back quicker. So in that context, the important thing about this and what makes this sort of a difficult issue is, talked about probability, we also have to think about consequences. And what are the consequences of power outages? And the consequences are really important. One of the major problems is you talk about resiliency, people can mean all sorts of different things. And a lot of the context about community resiliency talks about things like flooding impacts and things of that nature. One of the problems is electric power is difficult to sort of get your mind around in a lot of ways, but it's so foundational to the way society functions. And this graphic that we use here is one that I like to use, which refers to really electric power as kind of the keystone for all of these other key functions in society. The ability to provide the natural gas network and get that working, to be able to secure transportation, provide shelter, public health, etc. All of these fundamental services that are required in that immediate aftermath of a storm rely on electric power. And so it's an important thing for communities to have. And resilience really requires looking beyond the grid, but looking at what the grid enables. And this is important because David showed in his presentation earlier flooding around New Hanover County, for instance, after Hurricane Florence. Well, that flooding meant that they couldn't necessarily get diesel fuel to their backup generators. And so electric power was needed at those sites, but they couldn't necessarily get the fuel to provide it to them. One of the things to bear in mind with all of this is that utilities and communities and governments can see resilience differently. So communities may be thinking about, how they provide these services, whereas the utility is looking at how do I get electric power back on as quickly as possible in the most effective ways possible. And so there can be some incongruity to the way that communities and governments think about things versus the way utilities think about them. And that's an important point that we'll consider as we go through here. So to think about resilience, there's really kind of two elements, and I've touched on both of these a little bit, but the first is that resilience analysis is risk-based. All right, and that's different. That usually means that we're kind of taking a forward-looking approach to thinking about how we can develop a more resilient system. And so this is the way that our team looks at this, which is to basically say, if we think about a particular type of hazard or scenario that might occur, and we think about what kind of damages might occur, we say, okay, well, what does that do to the grid? And if I have that particular event happen, what's the change in power delivered? And then what's the consequences of that? So you got to quantify those consequences. What does that mean in terms of lost services or impact on the economy, et cetera, et cetera? And then you really have to look and say, well, what happens if I sort of filter in different planning options? What does that do to the way that the grid operates? So you really have to take into account both risk of certain events as well as the consequences of losing power from those events. The issue with resilience is it's contextual. All right, so resilience to one type of threat can be different than resilience to other types of threats. So I'll draw two examples here and kind of talk in some more detail about it. The first case might be things that David alluded to at the beginning, wildfire prevention in California, the extreme cold events that we saw this winter in in Texas, sorry, where we saw basically loss of generation or transmission. In other words, what that means is electrons stop being pushed through the network. All right, that's one type of event. A lot of the events that we've seen here in North Carolina are damage to the distribution system. And we see both of these, but if we look at a lot of the hurricane events, for instance, what we see is damage to the distribution system. And resilience to one of those cases is not the same as resilience to the other. That's an important distinction to make. So, to that point, what does the data tell us about what we see here in North Carolina? So what you're looking at is essentially information that was pulled for our team for one particular distribution circuit in North Carolina. And what you see here is, really kind of ultimately when we look at data in North Carolina, three types of conditions that we see. The first is, you get a situation where you have loss of generation or transmission. In other words, you're just not pushing power into the distribution network. There's no major damage to the distribution network, but generation is down. That's a very similar situation to what you saw in Texas. Okay. Second case is where you have outages lasting less than 24 hours, where you have some damage to the distribution system. Outages are widespread, but they're not necessarily all that long lasting. The third case would be where we have outages lasting much longer than 24 hours. We've got heavy damage to the distribution system. And just as an example of that, this is for one circuit here. If we look at four major events that happened in the 2010s decade, where you see that most of your events are less than 2 days long, but then you get something like Hurricane Florence where you're out for a very long period of time, basically over 2 weeks. So that gives you sort of an example. Most of these events are things that I would kind of put into that second case, and the Hurricane Florence situation is one I'd look at in that sort of lasting longer than 24 hours scenario. How you deal with those events, how you create resilience to those events is different in each case. So, a couple of important distinctions. I guess if you look at what's going on in North Carolina right now, a couple of years ago, Duke had put forth the Grid Improvement Plan in North Carolina, and it goes through a number of different programs that look at hardening the grid, and they talk about hardening and resiliency, targeted undergrounding, self-optimizing grid, a number of programs that ultimately improve the reliability of the grid. And have an impact as well on resiliency, but really go after reliability because that's really what the mandate is. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as I go through here, right? If I look at what the data tells us again here in North Carolina, that same circuit I talked about previously, if I look at that circuit, it has one of the lowest values of SAIDI in the county. In other words, it's a pretty reliable circuit. But if I look at the situation in Hurricane Florence, where there basically was a 2-week power outage, that power outage was really because of access issues that hampered the recovery. They couldn't get to the poles. And the point of this is that we don't always see, not generally, but not always, we don't always see a correlation between weak circuits from a reliability perspective versus where we actually see long duration outages during these big events. So there can be kind of a breakdown. It's somewhat difficult to get at vulnerability of the power system, and that's one of the key points, I guess, that I wanted to make. Resiliency is risk-based, and this was a point I made previously, and I want to hammer in on that. Reliability analysis makes use of historic data. So I can make graphs like this where I look at basically SAIDI values and use outage information over the last number of years to be able to say, okay, where has there been vulnerability over the last couple of years? And I want to make investments to deal with that. That's part of my mandate. Resiliency can begin to talk about what infrastructure is at risk under certain conditions. So for instance, you might look at an analysis like what I have shown here on the right, where you're looking at saying under certain hurricane conditions, under certain storm surge conditions, where might I have infrastructure at risk? All right, and so I want to look at that kind of information and sort of predict what I think might happen based on climate change and certain predictions there. So in this particular case, so for instance, Duke right now has their sort of climate resilience study that they have launched, and this is public information that they've shared about their process. The grid improvement plan does a lot to address things like substations, and substations is one of the things that are most likely at risk over time. But distribution system vulnerability can be really difficult. For instance, one of the things that we've seen is those poles that are out there. We find that in some cases, if it's rained a lot recently before a storm, the aquifers may be sort of charged up with water, and if you have trees with shallow roots, they may be more likely to fall because of previous rainfall. In other words, it's very difficult to look at a map and say, okay, well, I think this area is more vulnerable because it may change over time. And things like trees outside of the right-of-way might potentially have an impact. So one question that always comes up is how do DERs factor in? Microgrids can really improve resiliency, and Lee will talk about some specific examples here. But one of the questions always is how do you best utilize and value microgrids and DERs? So an example of this, the Hot Springs microgrid in North Carolina. One of the key things about this is it was approved as an example or as a pilot project. This particular case, you have a circuit that's running through sort of a relatively rugged area, and this is a picture of that feeder right here. Essentially, there's a high likelihood of trees falling and taking down that feeder during storms. In this particular case, Duke proposed a microgrid near the town, so if there was damage on that feeder, that they could serve the town for at least 4 hours while it was restored. And that microgrid could provide ancillary services that could potentially be valued. But the Utility Commission basically said, well, we need to look at alternatives to this. I mean, why not put a second feeder in or harden the feeder? It's not necessarily clear that the microgrid's the most cost-effective way to deal with the problem. And part of the reason is it's difficult to be able to value the benefits, particularly under blue sky conditions without real-world experience. So it was approved as a pilot. But one important thing I want to draw about that is if you think about this example, essentially, they're not worried about situations where the distribution system is really heavily damaged up here in the town. They're worried about the feeder coming into the town, and that's kind of the important piece. Microgrids are not always the solution that works for resiliency, because if that distribution system is heavily damaged, a microgrid for that feeder is not going to be the answer. And I think that's an important point that needs to be brought in mind. So to kind of wrap up here, I think one of the things that I want to bear in mind is this idea of I talked about those different types of events, right? So I might have power outages lasting, less than 24 hours, but then I can have these situations where it lasts for a long time. What do I do in that case? Well, one of the important things is how do you deal with being able to provide power for those community functions? So David talked about ways that people are trying to think about resilience metrics, and I've listed a number here that the DOE talks about. One example is basically talking about community impacts. So an indirect benefit, which talks about the storm's effect on power delivery to hospitals, wastewater plants, police stations, fire stations, other things that are key to community function. One thing that's clear is that certainly providing power at those facilities that enable community function through a microgrid, can help to alleviate concerns about getting diesel fuel to those locations. And it can also deal with those situations where I might have power outages that last more than a day or 2 days, right, which are particularly important. Those are sort of no-brainers, I think, in a lot of ways for microgrids. But it becomes difficult to figure out exactly how microgrids can be fully leveraged if you have these issues that can happen in the distribution network. The big challenge is really how do you value resiliency and developing resiliency policy. And I think the key takeaway here really is there's several states, and I mentioned them here, Hawaii and Georgia. There's a number of states that have looked at how do you value resiliency, and particularly how do you value things like microgrids and resiliency. Ultimately, what it comes down to is that, NARUC has summarized this. People have only really talked about DERs and microgrids having value from a qualitative perspective for decision making. It's very difficult to get quantitative, in part because of all of the challenges that I talked about what types of events are you most concerned about, and how do you factor in those values. So with that, I think hopefully that will lead in a little bit to our next speaker, who can talk a little bit more about some specific examples of those microgrids.
Thank you, Robert. This is Lee Ragsdale. I thought that was very well done. You covered a lot of great topics, and it's interesting to see where we are as a utility industry and how we're moving forward with bringing opportunities to improve reliability, improve resilience to our consumers, because electric service is important. And as you go back to that one chart of yours with the two pillars and the headstone being electric power, it's so essential for all that we do. And you can take that back to the founding of the co-ops, in the 30s and 40s around the country, where farmers got together and said, we need electric power for our communities. And they built these not-for-profit co-ops to bring power to their communities. NCMC is comprised of 26 co-ops across the state. We're in 93 counties out of the 100 counties in the state, and 45% of the land mass. We serve a lot of consumers around the state, and we're very proud of what we've been able to do. And so I want to talk to you for a few minutes about where we've been focused with our distribution operator initiative and some of the efforts we're making for resilience with our members, and specifically talk about two microgrid projects that we see as being an opportunity to showcase what's being done and where distributed energy resources can really help out with resilience on the edge of the grid. So there are a lot of things driving DER adoption. You've seen it in our state in North Carolina with the growth of utility scale solar, but also we're seeing growth in rooftop solar. You've seen it across the country as more and more renewable energy is brought to the grid, and it's needing to collaborate with the distribution and transmission systems to continue to enhance what's going on the grid. From our point of view, visibility and coordination are the key factors to have confidence and planning certainty. In the end, we as utilities have an obligation to serve the consumers in our service territories. We need confidence and certainty in the resources that we have to serve. And so visibility and coordination help provide that confidence. And then, so when we have DER growth coordinated with the utilities, we think that can lead to enhanced local resilience. So the cooperatives are working on building a brighter future for our members, and there's three pillars to that brighter future. Reliable electricity at the lowest possible cost. We are utilizing existing and new resources and technologies to achieve net zero by 2050. And we are supporting our communities through economic development and enrichment activities. We are in our communities, and our community focus is paramount. And I know some of our member co-ops are on the call today, and the efforts that they make in their local communities are amazing, and we really appreciate what they can do. So if you look at the state of North Carolina and the North Carolina co-ops overall, we have DER, distributed energy resources, spread throughout the entire state. From the community solar projects that we began in 2014, we have 19 community solar projects in red distributed across the state. We have utility scale solar from qualifying facilities as well as solar that we own. And we have solar plus storage that's being built. We have 4 active microgrids and 1 microgrid under development. And then we have demand response programs across the state. All told, all of these DER resources total about 15% of our current peak demand. So it's getting to the point where these are growing to where they are substantial as a part of our overall power supply portfolio. We need to be able to have dependable resources, and again, that's why we're focusing on our distribution operation. So what role does the distribution operator play? So the distribution operator is an enabler for the co-ops. It's focused on that visibility and coordination, and that enables reliability and value. Reliability on the grid, benefits to the grid itself, and then value in the portfolio, which as a co-op is spread back to all members. The blue lines in this chart, and I borrowed this from an EPRI Journal article from a number of years ago. The blue lines on this chart are new pathways of communications between the distribution operator and all of the DER that's coming out of the system, whether it's rooftop solar or standalone solar, battery storage, solar and storage combined, and then communicating upstream to the transmission provider so that they can have a better view of not only what they're serving, but also what could happen with weather and other applications. So Robert alluded to microgrids, and I mentioned them as well. I wanted to talk about the microgrids that we have and 2 neighborhood microgrids that are in place that can really speak to the value of resiliency for communities. So we have 4 operational microgrids. The first one was Ocracoke Island that began in February of 2017. You may have heard of Butler Farms, a hog growing operation in Lillington that has a biogas digester as well as storage on site. Heron's Nest and Eagle Chaser are 2 residential microgrids, and I will talk about each of those later. We view a microgrid as being a collection of resources, both generation as well as battery storage, that can separate from the grid, an island, but also are connected and benefiting the grid. It has been said that many commercial buildings are microgrids today. Many buildings have their own backup generation to support local resiliency, that single customer microgrid. The difference that I would make, the distinguishing factor between a microgrid and those buildings with backup generation, is most of the time that backup generation is inwardly focused. It's focused on how to protect that consumer. Microgrids are connected and coordinated with the utility, and it can actually benefit the utility as well. So when we build microgrids and install microgrids, we're looking at 3 objectives. 1 is demand response, paying for that microgrid. 2 is resilience, providing additional value to the members. And then 3 is sustainability. We've got a list of partners that you can see, and it's been a fun road. So what are the use cases? And sometimes when people talk about energy storage, they talk about microgrids, they talk about stacked values for these use cases. There's portfolio value, there's also consumer value. You heard Robert talk about ancillary services and what ancillary services that can be provided at the edge of the grid. Resiliency and reliability are important, but remember, the grid is fairly reliable, even though we have these low probability, high impact events. On an overall scale, reliability is high. But microgrids and edge of grid resources can also impact asset deferral. And I think that Hot Springs microgrid is another example of, can you avoid building an additional distribution feeder to serve a remote load? That's an opportunity as well. So all of those together empower bringing the microgrid to commercial operations. One of them is resiliency and reliability, but all of the other values also help to pay for it. The analogy I like to use when people talk about resilience and reliability is you have to ask, what are you willing to pay for reliability and resilience? And I think that's one of the things the metrics are challenged to identify, especially given it's a qualitative value. But the analogy is a cup of coffee. What are you willing to pay for a cup of coffee? Some people like going to Starbucks and paying $5, $6, $7 for a cup of coffee. Others might get a Keurig and have a K-cup and pay $1 for their cup of coffee. Others might brew a large pot and they're okay with not paying a lot for coffee because that's what they need. You as a consumer have to make a choice on what you're willing to pay for the services that you get. And I think in the utility space, we are working through that choice as well to think about, how do we provide the appropriate level of reliability? We want to maximize it as much as we can, but not at all cost. If our member consumers have trouble with the cost of electricity as it is today, we can't continue to invest more and more just to provide a different service. So going back to the microgrid, I talked about building microgrids. The distinguishing factor, I think, is the microgrid controller. And this is where engineers get really excited about the process. The controller is divided into 3 different levels. When you have devices at the edge of the grid, each of those devices have their own controller, that primary controller, controlling the storage, controlling the solar, controlling the loads at the site. The secondary controller is the site controller, which governs what the microgrid can do and allows the microgrid to island from the grid and to continue to manage a utility type service there locally. But that's coordinated from the DO, the distribution operator, the utility, on that tertiary controller. For NCEMC, we have a DERMS system that coordinates through our EMS and through our SCADA to send commands out to the individual microgrids. Those individual microgrid site controllers then send commands to the components to make it all happen. So, to the 2 examples that I wanted to talk about while we were here. First is Heron's Nest. Heron's Nest is a collaborative effort with Brunswick EMC and then a local residential real estate developer. The builder came to Brunswick and said he wanted to build a sustainable neighborhood. He wanted to put rooftop solar on the homes as he was building those homes. And then we partnered with them to also bring in thermostat controls for the air conditioning units, as well as water heater controls for managing load. And then also he put in a energy storage at the head of the neighborhood, and then a solar array at the head of the neighborhood. So now you have generation on each of the homes, you have generation for the community, and you have storage for the community. And that storage is what's the grid forming entity. So if the microgrid has to island, the storage can provide the grid, and all of the other resources continue to contribute. So this is a great balance between sustainability and individual contributions of the homes with the utility working together. Those resources are available even when the microgrid is not needed for, when there's not an islanding event. The 365 days out of the year when things are good, or 364 days out of the year when things are good, those resources contribute to the portfolio and contribute to the benefit of not only the 33 consumer homes in that neighborhood, but also all of the members of Brunswick EMC and all of the members of NCEMC, because those are resources that are being brought into the portfolio. So that microgrid has been online for a year and a half now. I'm pleased to say that we haven't had a resiliency need for that microgrid in that time. It has been up and running, but it has not needed to island. So we have not had to put it through its paces in a real-time example, but we have tested it and worked with that resource. And it has continued to contribute value to NCMC's portfolio and to all of our members for that time that it's been online. Next is Eagle Chase, another residential neighborhood in Wake EMC, so just outside of Wake Forest. This is a resilient neighborhood with a 36-hour backup power. The use case was a little bit different. The real estate developer came to Wake EMC and was thinking about putting backup generation at each of the 30 homes that they were building. So 30 22 kW propane powered backup generators at those 30 homes. When Wake EMC talked to them, we came to the realization that there would actually be more value in having a single generator for the entire neighborhood. You could make a smaller generator, so that we have a 300 kW propane generator there with propane tanks associated with it, and we could put a battery on site, so we have a 500 kW Tesla battery on site, and use those resources collectively for the neighborhood to provide resilience. So this neighborhood, this microgrid just came online this spring. In the picture on the right, you can see upper left-hand corner is the propane generator, upper right-hand corner is the Tesla battery power, and then on the little further forward on the right, you have the utility controls, the grid mind controller, as well as the switchgear to make it happen. This neighborhood is an underground, has underground utility service and can island, and has islanded on occasion, both in a test mode as well as when there were some voltage flickers on the distribution system. That's providing resiliency and reliability for that neighborhood. The interesting thing is both both Eagle Chase and Heron's Nest depend upon the utilities infrastructure to deliver these DER to the consumers. With underground utilities, the internal distribution network has not been impacted, but the circuit delivering to that neighborhood does get impacted by storms, by other events. And so this is a balance. Again, Eagle Chase is available to provide value in the portfolio all the other days of the year when there's not an event happening. And so that's been a good benefit to us as well. So I bring it all together to say that the infrastructure on the utility side is necessary for the DER, and we're able to balance those local needs with the community needs as well. So the grid is evolving, and that's why we're here, is to learn how the grid is evolving and what we can do. We feel that the distribution operator is critical to that visibility and coordination. I want to keep it reiterating that the visibility and coordination of DER as solar continues to grow on the network, understanding being able to see what the solar is doing and be able to depend upon it is essential for the utility to deliver dependable service. Again, that coordination provides opportunities for growth, and we will continue to see improved reliability and enhanced resilience to member consumers as a result of all of these activities. So with that, I will pause and see if there's any questions in the chat, and then I think the three of us are also going to be available for questions. The one that says, what's the primary communication protocols for the communication between the DOs and the DER currently? IEEE 2030.5 is a standard that we are using, and I think that we are adhering to that standard. As resources continue to develop, that becomes more and more open. Right now, we have direct communications to the DER and are working through that, but I think we'll have a growth of a more open network as 2030.5 is further adopted.
Thank you, Lee, for that. And Rob and Lee, both of you, those were very informative presentations, and we do appreciate you participating in this. A lot of good information there. And one final slide before we move to our Q&A session. This is similar to what Rob was showing a few minutes ago, but it's just important to reiterate this. I think we're showing the same information in a slightly different format. Energy is really the hub of community resilience. Everything else is dependent upon it. And so it's important as utility people, like a lot of folks on this in the webinar are, just to realize that our communication infrastructure, healthcare system, financial services, all of these functions are essential for sustaining human life and working communities, and they all rely on the power grid to function. Mobile devices, computers, the internet, all those things are essential for communications and staying in touch with people, which will be critical during an event, but they all rely on the electric power to operate. So really energy is at the hub of community resilience. So just wanted to reiterate that. That really includes our presentations. At this point, we'd like to take a few minutes to answer some of the questions. Understand, please, that we may not have time today to answer all your questions. We may not have an immediate answer to a question, but in either case, we'll do our best to follow up with you after doing some research or finding the best resource for you. So Lee, you answered one of the questions already. One of the questions that had come in also, to what extent, I'll pass this to Lee, and Rob, if you want to comment as well, jump in. To what extent do you feel innovative electric rate design can help to enhance reliability and resiliency of the electric grid? And is there any activity at the NC Commission or Legislature around dynamic rates or critical peak pricing? Lee, you want to take that?
Yes, David, thank you. So it's a great question. I think that the use of rates helps to encourage behavior from consumers as well as behavior from producers. And so to the extent that innovative rates and dynamic pricing and time of use pricing can get into our rate structures, they will encourage DER to participate in ways that improve reliability and resiliency at the edge of the grid. They will also, innovative rate structures can encourage more resources to be online and available. And so that and available when they're needed the most. So I think that that is a great opportunity to passively work with resources to improve reliability and resiliency by giving financial incentives to manage those resources. That's as opposed to the active management where a microgrid controller is linking with the utility. There's a balance there between active management and the passive management through rate structures.
Okay, great. Rob, anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that covers it well.
Okay. Another question that had been submitted, are there any activities being strengthened through hardware in the loop testing? And if so, how? Lee, can you take that?
Sure. So we've worked with universities on hardware in the loop testing and our vendors as well. And I think that we have done a good job. The challenge is it's hard to replicate all of the activities that you're going to see in the lab with what's in the real world. So we are also doing active scenarios in the real world to make sure that these resources behave as they can. So it's definitely a combination of hardware in the loop testing as well as real world examples. And that's kind of the reason we've been growing into these microgrids. We did our first one in 2017 as a living laboratory, as a research and development facility on Ocracoke Island, and now we've expanded out to have more fundamental microgrids throughout the system.
And I guess I would add to that, David. I mean, I think exactly what Lee noted. We've done some hardware in the loop testing as well here within Epic. We currently have a project funded by the Department of Energy looking at community microgrids and network community microgrids, where we're partnered with Duke on that project. And one of the major problems, and I think what Lee is alluding to, is really trying to be able to model what actually happens in the system, particularly in the islanded conditions, and being able to make sure that the models that you have are valid, so that when you're doing that testing, that you're really getting the most out of it. That's a big challenge, and that's actually, I think, to some extent kind of an open question, how to get those models well defined. And that's a big piece of what we're actually trying to work on right now, and doing some testing in combination with NREL to see if we can kind of better improve some of the models that are included as part of that testing.
Yeah, it's interesting, the physics with rotating machines versus inverter-based resources really gets complicated quickly, and a lot of our system is designed, our protection systems are designed around rotating machinery, and so it's getting those models right is a learning curve, and we're definitely growing that way.
Yeah, and that's a problem I think everyone's dealing with right now.
Okay, thanks. There is a question in the chat, and I think we're running out of time, but just briefly, it's a vehicle to grid question, basically. What activities are in place right now to make that process work, where you could actually run your home from a car battery, basically? I've heard a lot about vehicle to grid type technology, particularly at the larger levels, but what kind of activities are taking place right now around that? Rob, do you have any insight on that, or Lee?
Well, Lee may be able to talk specifically. I mean, vehicle to grid is something that's been talked about for a long time, and there are possibilities of doing that. Very limited scale. I mean, I don't think there's much at all commercially on that. One of the challenges about what I see there in the question, which is always a challenge too, is I think he talks about backfeeding the grid. I think one of the things that always you need to be concerned about in those situations is backfeeding the grid from something, from anything, whether it's your car or whatnot, and making sure that you're not backfeeding into the grid. That's a real no-no, and I think that's one of the big issues is how do you also make sure that you are safe when you're doing this, and obviously things like that can be worked around, but that's always one of the questions too, is making sure that you're safe in what you're doing. And there needs to be the appropriate switches in place to be able to deal with that kind of situation. The specifics of rollout of vehicle to grid, I don't know, Lee, if you know of specific examples where folks are using it. I've seen some discussion around it, but not in any widespread manner.
Yeah, I think there's been some discussion. I know that Roanoke EMC has a single vehicle to grid charger that they've been testing out. Some people have been trying to commercialize vehicle to grid. Ford with the F-150 talked about vehicle to building. You can power a job site, you can power your home with the new F-150 Lightning that's coming out next year. It's a great opportunity, and I think long term we'll get there. But it takes agreement from the car manufacturers on warranty items associated with the battery. It takes protection and control and system safety, like you talked about on the grid, and then just thinking about consumer behavior. How willing are consumers to allow their source of transportation to be drained for the grid needs or for their own individual building needs?
Yes, excellent discussion. Thank you both. Again, that's really all the time we have. There are other interesting questions coming in. We will certainly try to reply to you directly on any of the questions that have come in. But that's all the time we have today. Before we close, though, I do want to extend our appreciation to all the stakeholders, the many people from Duke Energy, North Carolina's electric cooperatives, North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, the public staff of the North Carolina Utilities Commission, and Dominion Energy, who provide input and guidance to make this program a success, and especially our guest speakers, Robert Cox and Lee Ragsdale. We want to remind everyone to visit the NC Smart Grid website at ncsmartgrid.org, where you'll find recordings of all of our past Smart Grid webinars, and a recording of this webinar will be posted in a few days. At this point, I'll end today's webinar by sharing our participation satisfaction survey. Be aware you'll see a warning message pop up that you're going to an external site. You can select continue and proceed to the survey. We really do want you to help us improve by filling out the survey so we can continue to offer valuable information and resources to you. We're grateful that you took time out of your day to join us for the webinar. Have a great rest of your day, and we hope to see you at a future webinar. Thank you.